Good morning. I am with Dr. Tori Stone, and we are going to discuss part three of It Ends With Us Fostering Resilience. And this talk today will focus on what school counselors can do when working with children who are experiencing trauma from interpersonal violence or from dating violence. And so we'll give a brief review of trauma and the brain, a review of ACEs, which we know so many of you know about, and then we'll also give you some strategies of work that you can do. Both Tori and I are faculty members at George Mason University and former school counselors with a number of years of experiences. And we have both worked in private practice settings. Tori, did you want to add anything else?
I think we can get going.
All righty. So we're going to start with a brief review of trauma and just covering the brain.
So yeah, I think it's really important for school counselors. So full disclosure, not a neurologist, not a neuropsychologist, just a therapist and a school counselor who got really interested in the brain about maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I just try to learn as much as I can about brain science because I think it really helps us to understand kids' behavior. And so when we're talking about trauma, violence, we're really talking about a lot of activation in the amygdala. And I don't know if you can see my little brain here, but brain, just a quick review, brain develops back to front. And the amygdala, because we have two hemispheres of our brain, so two amygdalae. If we could kind of drill into our brain, which wouldn't be a good thing, they're behind both eyes, right? And so when kids, and the language, I think different people have different comfort with language around this. So whatever language works for you. So Dan Siegel, probably all have seen his hand model of the brain where he talks about flipping your lid. You may have seen me before, and I always have my Coke bottle that you get shook up. So when we see kids get activated, right? They move from the front of their brain, their prefrontal cortex. This is a thinking part of their brain. This controls their impulses. This helps them to make good decisions, their judgment, their planning, empathy, right? So when activation takes place, and this I think is really important for us to keep in mind, when I say activation, it could be a real event that takes place in the classroom, in the counselor's office, on the playground. It could also be a tape in their head that is playing, right? So they're remembering something that took place. It's a quiet time in the classroom. They're doing their work. All of a sudden, they're seeing a download of something that happened in their home in the past or some traumatic event. So sometimes we know what causes a kid to sort of flip or get shook up, right? Sometimes we don't. The bottom line is we need to be able to recognize that when kids are flipped, when they're in their amygdala, I use my dinosaur here to demonstrate that, right? When kids are here, when they're in this kind of really mobilized state, they are not available for consultation. And so a lot of the strategies that we use as adults and teachers use, and I say this with great love for educators, right? But number one, they can't do what we're asking them to do in those moments. And number two, we can make it worse. So a lot of times when kids get flipped, they go to that sympathetic activation. It causes us as the adults in the room to go to our sympathetic activated parts. And I've misplaced my other dinosaur. And so if you can imagine, here's the kid who's activated, and here's the teacher who's all shook up, and now we're making it worse, right? And this is where we can see violence take place in the classroom, where the child might, best case scenario, tell the teacher to F off and run away. Worst case scenario, they flip the desk or they hurt the teacher, right? The more that we have kids who are living in situations where that sympathetic part of their brain, where that amygdala is getting mobilized, where they're having sympathetic activation, the more that happens, that's a pathway, right? And so the amygdala can actually grow. It becomes a well-worn road. So when we see kids who've experienced a lot of trauma, domestic violence in the home, violence in their communities, we can see a really hair trigger response. And we'll hear this in schools where adults will say, like, nothing even happened and they just flipped out. And again, this blame language that there's something wrong with the child, when I would want to flip that from what's wrong with this child to what has happened to this child. What has happened to this child that they're so easily mobilized? And, our nervous systems, and I'll say more about this in a second, but our nervous systems are always looking for connections. We want to be loved, we want to feel safe, and they're scanning for threat. And when we have a kid who's really quickly sent to their amygdala, those are children who have been activated repeatedly, and they need our love, they need our guidance, they need us to be the adult. One more quick thing I just want to mention as we review brain science, because I think it's so important to our work in schools. Once kids move from the front of their brain to sympathetic mobilization, or they get into the middle of their brain, into the limbic area of their brain, the prefrontal cortex is protected. And the more activated a kid gets, the more there's a shutdown of that prefrontal part of the brain. And so kids literally are not able to necessarily control their behavior as well, but it also stops storage of information. So when we've got a kid who's mobilized or totally shut down in the classroom, and the teacher, whoever's like, I'm gonna power through, I'm gonna keep teaching, I've got SOLs, that child is not retaining that information. When a kid pops off in the classroom, they can activate other kids. So other kids go from the front of their brain, flip, and they get activated. So you can have a whole classroom full of kids because of one outburst. Even if we remove this kid, he's gone. School counselor comes and gets him, he's gone. The rest of the class can be mobilized. They're not learning. So if we can take a minute to train our teachers or us as school counselors to come back and address the class and say, I know that was really scary. Let's just take some time. Let's do your breathing, do all the great stuff that you do as school counselors. We're going to get everybody else back ready to learn and be available for learning. So I think when we ignore the elephant, when we ignore, in this case, the dinosaur, we actually impair the learning of the whole classroom. Where if we took a couple minutes to just let everybody settle, learning can then resume. And so kind of to add on to this, when we talk about your nervous system, so the nervous system is a hierarchy, okay? And so as we have grown and changed and evolved over millions of years, we keep building. So we had a very primitive part of our nervous system. This is called the autonomic ladder. And if you're like, wow, I'm really interested in this, I like this, I would really, really encourage you to take a look at Deb Dana's work. So Stephen Porges came up with this idea of polyvagal theory in the polyvagal theory period, which is incredibly interesting, but it is a medical model, so it's pretty complex. So first time I saw Porges, I was like, wow, this is great, but I understand maybe 20%. And then I found Deb Dana, and Deb Dana is just a wonderful, kind of beautiful ventral, I'll say more about that, social worker. And she translated the polyvagal theory into therapy. And lots of folks in the trauma community use polyvagal as a way to understand what's happening with our kids, with our teachers, with us as human beings. And she broke it down in a beautiful way. And this is called the autonomic ladder. And I'm like a brain nerd. So she actually created, this is great for school counselors, I think. It's called the polyvagal flip chart. How cool is this? It's available on Amazon. And the autonomic ladder is in there. So basically, our nervous system, as I said earlier, is always looking for connections and scanning for threats. Babies are born with an undeveloped nervous system, and they find, again, not a neurologist, but I think of it like AirPods finding your phone, right? So that little baby with a really immature nervous system, when the primary caregiver, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever it is, provides them safety, provides them comfort, helps them to settle, they link up. And our nervous system can be a guide for the nervous systems of others. This is true with all mammals. This is why dogs can be really comforting for children, or cats. We want to kind of stay away from reptiles because it's a different system, right? But for kids who've experienced a lot of trauma, maybe they're not great with other people, but a family pet can be incredibly regulating for them. I think when my daughter was a baby, she would get really, really, really upset. And that's mobilization, okay? That sympathetic mobilization midway down the ladder. And she'd get so upset, and I would pick her up and hold her and rub her, you're okay, baby. And there'd be a point where she'd go, ah, and she would stop crying. And I think of that now as link, my nervous system was able to communicate to her nervous system, this is a safe place. I suspect school counselors, you are these healthy nervous systems in schools for kids. And I think the more we understand this, I don't know why I'm really good at helping kids settle at school, but I just am. I suspect you have a lot of ventral energy. So when you look at this automatic ladder, the newest part of our nervous system is ventral. That's our social engagement system, where we feel safe and connected. A lot of our ventral energy and really when we're looking for connections, when we're scanning for when our nervous system is scanning other people and looking for what's safe or what's not safe, it's in our eyes, it's in our voice, that we want to communicate this sense of safety, connectedness. And so at the top of the ladder, this is where kids can be socially engaged, they can feel safe, and they can feel connected. This is ideally where most kids are most of the day at school. We move down the ladder, that's sympathetic mobilization. We talk about, your sympathetic and parasympathetic. So ventral will be more of a parasympathetic, sympathetic activation. This is mobilization. So some kids, mobilization is flight, right? They're going to run out of the classroom. For some kids, it's fight. We can help kids to recognize when they're moving down the ladder. You can teach this to kids, right? When they're moving down the ladder. And a lot of times what I'll say to kids is, where do you feel that in your body? And a lot of kids will say, in my hands. That's a fight response, probably. My feet tingle. I can remember one guy, he was a runner. My feet are tingling. That was a mobilization, right? He wanted to run away. So if we can pay attention, if we can get kids to tune into what's happening in their body, and then for our littles or our kids who really have experienced a lot of trauma or dysregulation, that we can train the adults to pay attention when we start to see mobilization. For our anxious kids, this can be the foot, the leg is going, the hand is tapping, right? Behaviors that can be annoying to others can also be indicators to us as adults that this kid needs a break. So maybe they need to go get a glass of water, maybe they need to take a note to the office, maybe they need to go talk. This is where our flash passes, our anytime passes are great to allow the kid who starts to feel activation to get out of the classroom. So I feel like as school counselors, we're pretty aware that there is a ventral place. There's a place where we're safe and connected and socially engaged. We get sympathetic activation. We get that moving down the ladder. I think the piece, and this is where Porter just really made a huge contribution. I think this is great for teachers and counselors to understand, is the bottom of the ladder. So we have a phylogenetic relative, turtles, okay? And when you think about when a turtle is threatened, what do, right? They go in their shell, right? They shut down. So the dorsal vagal state is mobilization of life threat. Okay, so they're totally shut down, they're collapsed. We have these kids in our classrooms. They come to school, they've experienced trauma in the home, maybe there's violence in the home, things have happened. They come in, they put their head down, they sit in the back of the room. Everything about their body language says, leave me alone. And ultimately, unfortunately, they get into situations in schools in a healthy way or an unhealthy way where some adult is, I know Shaquila likes my hermit crab, so I'm going to bust out my crabby guy because I think this is a good way to show it, right? So I got my hermit crab guy. So this is a great way to show dorsal. So this comes to school, they're activated. Now they're in their shell. Some adult is like, come on, I need you to pay attention. It's time to do math. What are you doing, right? And now this kid goes from shut down in the back of the classroom, really trying to protect themselves, to mobilization and potentially dangerous to themselves or to other people. This is a ladder. So in order to get to the top, back to ventral, socially engaged, they have to go through sympathetic mobilization. So when we poke the bear, so to speak, we potentially create risk for the child and for ourselves. And I think this is really something helpful when sometimes Shaquille and I do work with teachers, with whole schools, and teachers will say, why didn't I ever learn this, right? Why didn't I ever know this? There are ways that we can connect with this child, and school counselors, you do this all the time. Teacher calls you, you go to the classroom, you kneel next to the classroom, you say, baby, why don't you come with me? Come on. And very quietly, you take them to their office, dim the lights, let them sit in your beanbag, let them chill. And then they can come back up to a place of engagement where they can talk with you, or they can feel better, they can say what's going on. So I think understanding the nervous system, understanding what's happening, can really shift that from, that's a bad kid, or that's a scary kid, or that kid doesn't belong here, that's a dangerous kid, for us as adults to recognize our role in provoking kids, and also recognizing that not every kid who comes to school has had the same autonomic experience in the home, and they may be seeking connection and love. And good news, schools are full of adults who can provide it.
So let's make a connection between kind of the nervous system and what is prompting that dysregulation in the children and adolescents that we serve. So I know that all of us understand ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, but let's kind of make that firm connection. So if I'm experiencing significant trauma in the home, and also perhaps in the community, then that level of dysregulation is inevitable at some point, right? But I want to highlight certain aspects of adverse childhood experiences that I don't think are stressed enough. And so we spend a lot of time kind of discussing, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, substance abuse in the home, parent separation. But I do recognize that one aspect of adverse childhood experiences that we don't spend a lot of time talking on are aspects of oppression. So, racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination. And so, when we think about things like race based trauma, the trauma that is experienced by individuals in the LGBTQ community who are not out or who feel a sense of discomfort or who are out in school but or closeted at home. And so when we talk a lot about the dysregulation, we have a tendency to miss that cultural component. And then we also forget that these become complex. So if I'm experiencing emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and then there's someone in my home who also is abusing substances, and also I'm experiencing a form of discrimination, that is becoming compiled. And when that becomes compiled, I'm just kind of sitting with that, right? Because as a younger person, I'm trying to learn self regulation. And oftentimes they misunderstand self regulation for just suppressing. And then they often explode at some point in time. And so when they come into the school, we either are going to help or we are going to add. And oftentimes, when we think about school systems are hotbeds of oppression. They're a part of the system. And so schools contribute to these adverse childhood experiences, which I think is hard for us to understand. But schools really are contributing factors to adverse childhood experiences every time, for instance, a Black or Brown child is told that they cannot do something, especially related to academic achievement. Or if a little girl is told that she doesn't need to go into STEM, she just needs to stay over here in art class. We are contributing to that adverse childhood experience. So even when we are trying to kind of utilize this ventral state, this kind of security for the children and adolescents that we are serving, that means that we also have to be aware of the contributions we are making to eradicating aspects of oppression in the system, the school system in and of itself. We don't want to contribute, right? And I think that's going to be an interesting observation that a lot of this will make as we go back into schools in the fall. Are we contributing to a student's dysregulation? Is the system in which they are in contributing to their dysregulation? And then what responsibility do we have as counselors, as educators in the building to bring children back to a regulated state? And also to recognize when we ourselves may not be regulated. So now we're going to start to walk this line together that I think is going to be an interesting parallel when we get back into the fall. So one thing when Tori and I talk a lot about this work, and we always go into that adverse childhood experience review, it feels different now. And I think it's always important to review because I think now we are starting to see this kind of layer. And a pandemic is a natural disaster. So now we're taking what I would say this kind of individual, interpersonal, in family trauma to this global community trauma. So now I'm not just experiencing trauma in my home. I am experiencing it through the community. I am experiencing it through the entire country. I'm experiencing it through the world. So now my trauma is just not within my home. My trauma is vicarious. My trauma is layered. My trauma is complex. So even if I did not experience any of these things in my home, I may have experienced some of these: the pandemic, racism, sexism, or another form of discrimination. So I really would like to encourage us to consider those systemic pieces that we don't always address when we're working with children who have experienced trauma, and to move away from just the stereotypical conversations that I think a lot of us, when we were in graduate school, were told. Like, we were taught a lot about child abuse and having those conversations. This is different. And so we need to be very conscious of that. And trauma related to discrimination leads to anxiety, depression, maladaptive behaviors. It is generational in nature. And so that child comes with family, and the family is impacted by that generational trauma as well. And so it becomes such an interesting layered component that we should pay attention to in schools. And we talked a little bit about this, like, just very briefly, because I addressed it kind of from a discriminatory position of like, if I'm experiencing discrimination, then these are some implications. But now consider that layered piece again. If we are going through so much stuff, if I am 12 years old and I'm going through so much stuff, there is a strong possibility that these things can happen. That is just an implication. That is just research. The idea is that we become preventative in nature. That is part of our job. That we say, once trauma happens, the trauma has happened. But what we can do is return you back to a secure attachment. And so you may have a disruption, but we can repair some. We can never change the disruption that happened, but we can have some type of repair in nature. And so we can see things like mental health issues come up later on down the road, maybe intimate partner violence, feelings of suicidality, wanting to complete suicide, and even having a physiological response. You can start to have chronic health conditions from the amount of trauma experience. If you go look at specifically race-based trauma, there's a lot of connections of shifts in genetic makeup in terms of high blood pressure, heart disease that comes from the generational trauma that people are experiencing. The behavioral disruption, like what Tori talked about. If I have a lot going on, and we're like this as grown-ups, if I have a lot going on, I'm not going to thrive in a space. I'm going to disrupt in some shape or form. As a grown-up, I might just kind of be a little snippy. I might be like, I'm not dealing with you today. If I'm a teenager, I'm like, you don't get the F out of my face. I told you 2 and 3 times. And I would always encourage a grown-up, if someone tells you 2 and 3 times, leave them alone. Kids and adolescents are their own people with their own feelings, with their own stress. They don't need you adding to it. Leave them alone. So when we understand these implications, it should help us kind of take a step back if we're starting to get to a point of we're punishing. We're essentially punishing someone's trauma and punishing someone's pain. The response that they're having is what you're punishing. So now you're just kind of contributing to the negative aspects of their life that they're already experiencing. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, like in the grand scheme, and I don't think that's our intention, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And so those are a few implications. Tori, did you want to add anything? I know I talk fast.
No, I would just add, I agree 100% with everything Shaquila said. I think that, I can hear a lot of educators saying, well, there's no consequence to that kind of disruption. The consequence doesn't take place when the child is activated, right? So we have to let them settle. How many times have you talked to a kid who knows that they stepped out, right? But how often as educators do we recognize that the adult in the room also did not follow the code, right? So we talk a lot about the code of conduct for kids, and these are your violations. But do we really address with the adult the ways in which their behavior escalated a situation where if they had allowed the child to leave the situation, they would have been spared, number one, the trauma to the other kids in the classroom potentially, but number two, re-traumatizing that child. And we've got adults in schools, we know that, who have high ACE scores, right? And so they themselves come to school and are dysregulated. And so it's really easy for them to be flipped. So I think if when we talk about school climate, we really have to be addressing the mental health of every single stakeholder. To the piece that Shaquila said in equity, I really think, and I'll say this as a white woman and educator, we have got to recognize in a situation where if it was the PTO president's daughter, or if it was my daughter, right, who was behaving that way versus a Black or brown male, how would we respond? What would the consequence be? How many kids are we saying, oh, this child has an anxiety disorder, this child had terrible trauma, we're going to give them counseling, we're going to give them access to services, and then versus the kid that we're just like, they're out, send them to alternative education. So we really have to check ourselves before we wreck our kids, really. So recognizing that we have policies and practices in place in our schools that are absolutely disproportionately hurting boys and students of color. And then really examining our practice. How would I treat this child if they were XYZ? We all know that there are folks in our schools who have power positions. And let's acknowledge it, and then let's strive to do better. So when we talk about resilience, I think it's really important to have those adults. And I think school counselors can be those adults who can really insulate and support kids. So we have kids who come to school, I'm using cups here. They come to school, they've had adverse childhood experiences. They have some holes in their cups that are dysregulated. They have a high ACE score, right? And one of the things that we can do is be a protective factor for kids, right? So we've got Yeti kids in our schools, right? They're really well insulated. They have lots of protective factors. These kids are probably going to be fine. You probably know their parents well. These kids potentially need, so FAIR is giving people what they need. I want to say that when I hear people say, let's treat everybody the same. No, these are my kids. They're fine. I got them. You have my permission, right? To, meet the minimum standard here. Okay. For kids who need more support, okay, in the resilience literature, there's something called the cascade effect. So I, as a school counselor, can provide support to this child, but I can also introduce them to the rest of the village. And so I can get PE teachers, coaches, people in the community, other teachers. I can get this kid a whole team of adults who see them, recognize them, love them. And now suddenly this cup that would not hold water, right? This child who really had trouble with regulation, they didn't have a lot of sources of support. Is it as strong as the Yeti cup? No, it's not, but it's much stronger than it was. When I teach the kid the skills to have positive connected relationships with other adults and to find those people, and that is a skill that we teach as school counselors. Like, you got to find your people. Or I make a phone call to the high school counselor when the child's leaving middle school. I need you to take care of my boy, right? We do this all the time. We are helping them to, I don't have any more cups, but we are helping them to continue creating this insulation throughout the rest of their life. We're connecting them with a village. That builds resiliency. And it's a salve for those early traumatic experiences or for ongoing traumatic experience. Because now the child, as they get older, has a dialogue to say, I can't depend on XYZ in my home, but I can depend on all these people who see me and love me at school. Or I don't know what to do when something is unsafe in my home, but I know that Mrs. Melchior does, right? So having those people at school who have the child boosts resiliency. And that's one of the greatest things that we do that is a protective factor for kids who are experiencing violence in their home.
And it makes me think of the idea of like the teacher as an emotional base. And I know that it can be, I can speak for myself the first time as a school counselor when I was looked at as a parent and I was only 25 and I was a high school counselor. And I'm like I probably could be your sibling, not your whole mom. But I think if we kind of take that, and especially if you look at relational cultural theory that says the power of connection, that you repair a lot of trauma, a lot of disconnection through relationship. The idea is that the more that we reconnect, and if you even look at the circle of security, the way that we connect and create that secure attachment is when you offer help, when you say, hey, I'm proud of you, when you are protecting the child. And of course, in a school setting, oftentimes it's hard to see what that looks like. But when the teacher or the school counselor says, take a minute, take a walk, you don't have to do it right now. Let's come back to it later. That is a modeling, because as that child gets older, they're able to say to someone else, take a minute. I don't have to talk about it right now. Or to themselves, I'm going to take a minute. I can't talk about this right now. And so as we kind of create this connection as adults and we maintain high expectations, it does become a really strong predictor of academic growth. Kids will thrive if you care about them and also hold them to a high expectation. And when I say high expectation, it's your best, not the best that we have created, not a perfect 600 on your SOL, not a perfect score on your SATs. Your best is what I'm holding you to. And then I'm going to honor that. And I'm going to be supportive of you. And the idea, and I always say this to the kids in my life, we are to be kind always. And that's the same for us as adults, because that is what increases a child's ability to learn. And even us as adults, I imagine in grad school, I learned better when someone was kind to me, when someone was supportive of me. So to be kind always and to strengthen that connection, that it is a positive one. And so that way, the child always has the opportunity to return to the secure adult. If there's no secure adult in the home and they have you, they can always return. And that in and of itself fosters a secure attachment, because the secure attachment doesn't have to be with the person who takes care of them at home necessarily. And sometimes we push that more than needs to be. They need to be able to have secure, healthy, nurturing relationship where the person is kind and supportive of them so that they can become healthy, whole, wise adults that will take care of us when we're in our retirement age, which is always a positive.
Yeah, and my word for this, and this comes from circle of security literature. We need adults, schools full of adults who are bigger, stronger, wiser, kind. That's the circle of security. I add mentally healthy, emotionally in control. Every single one of you, if I ask you right now, think of an adult in your building who is not those things. That's a project that you have for this school. You're getting that person support because they probably have a high A score. Talking with your administration, talking with that individual, whatever it is, because we know that these folks in schools do harm. They do harm to Yeti kids, and they do a lot of harm to kids who have high A scores who are at risk. From a biological perspective, when we feel safe, what makes us feel safe? Adults who are calm, adults who are kind, that ventral connection of love, an adult who's in charge. That feeling of like, this is a safe place. When we have teachers, educators with lots of ventral energy, kids will feel safe. So important to kids who do not have a healthy nervous system in their home, right? So this is going to improve behavior in the classroom. It's going to improve behavior in the whole building. When kids feel safe, trust develops. And that's why you're probably the adult for a lot of kids who they're like, I'm okay with Mrs. So-and-so, right? Or Mr. So-and-so. But you'll have that in your teams, like, well, she's fine for me, right? There's some kind of energy. There's some kind of connection there. Kids feel safe, they trust. When trust happens, they cooperate. That's a biological imperative. We lived in community villages together. We had to cooperate or we would die, right? So that exists. If we can get every stakeholder in our school building to recognize that the way to connect with children is not to control them, it really is to love them and to meet their basic needs, our schools will be different places. We'll have healthier kids, and that will change our world. And we could use a bit of that.
I know that we have to wrap up, but something you just said, Tori, made me think of this part because I didn't think we'd be able to get to it, which is, and I think it's important for us to recognize when we're in a position of block care. So are we so stressed out that we cannot successfully do our work? And that's, when we're getting, not necessarily at a point of burnout. I think kind of that's a misunderstanding. We're saying when you are having a hard time, and so there's no kind of reward, there's no relational reward in your position. And so you are operating just like the student. You're in that lower, more primitive brain system. And imagine when you're both kind of in that same part, or if you're chronically dysregulated, you cannot see clearly. And then that's where kind of that problematic behavior comes from both the teacher and then in turn the child is responsive and or vice versa. We're becoming very reactionary. And so I would encourage us, especially again, going into this fall year and just going into a school year period as a school counselor and educator, take note of yourself. What are you experiencing in your body? What are you experiencing as you're getting ready to start the school year? What have you experienced in your own life that you think could make that could contribute to your work in the school? And is that in a positive way or a negative way? What work do you need to do on yourself so that you're able to go back into the school healthy and whole and emotionally in control? I think that was just something that we have all experienced, but it's important for us to acknowledge where that is in our bodies. I know we have some resources as well. Tori put a whole lot to share. Did you want to highlight any in particular, Tori?
The Deb Dana book that I referenced earlier is here. There's a lot of resources, just kind of great, I think just good stuff to know. We would never recommend books that we haven't read ourselves. So if you want to learn more about trauma, we referenced a book there, more about polyvagal, lots of information. I know that as you prepare to go back to school, you're not necessarily like, give me more books. But I would say we name this series, It Ends With Us, because we believe in the power of prevention. We believe in the courageous conversations that school counselors can have to identify systemic issues that exist in our schools that are making kids less safe and are keeping them from learning. And so I hope that as we're recording this, and I know you'll see it at different times, as we're recording this, we're on the precipice of going back to school. I hope that you will be able to reach down and find that courage and recognize that you are, throwing that pebble in the pond, that it is going to ripple out and it has long-term consequences. We can change the deleterious effects of adverse childhood experiences. We can create resilient, learners. We can help kids to heal trauma in schools through our loving, connected relationships. What you do matters. It makes a difference. And so I thank you for watching and being here. And I thank you for the work that you do every day because it matters.